Hello, my name's Gavin, and this is Genre Books, and this is the continuing deep dive into the issues of Planet Stories, a Sword and Planet science fiction pulp magazine from what ran from the late 30s to the mid 1950s. We're still in the early days here. This is issue number 4, the autumn or the fall of 1940. There are 8 novels, novelettes and stories of various lengths to cover, which we'll be doing in a moment, and a look at the works of Ed Earl Repp, one of the writers featured in this issue. And he was thinking about the other work that Ed Earl Repp did, probably what he's more famous for, which led me to look through some of the other contributors to Planet Stories in thinking about their involvement with film and television. I'm not talking about adaptations here, although there are writers who had their works adapted into sometimes quite big films, and we're looking at Isaac Asimov, Philip K. Dick, Ray Bradbury. I'm also not talking about writers who had their ideas taken and put on the television screen. Damon Knight, again Ray Bradbury, Jerome Bixby, who we'll get to later in this look at Planet Stories, because he becomes the editor briefly. Richard Matheson, Catherine Moore and Henry Kuttner. All of these writers, with the exception of Matheson, wrote for Planet Stories, and all of them had either ideas taken or adapted themselves for the Twilight Zone. Other people are covering the Twilight Zone with much more authority and depth than I'll be able to, but I would just simply recommend the series to anyone who wants to watch something which is a lot of fun, shows a lot of old sci-fi authors, sometimes in their only translation to the small screen, and is also great for anyone who wants to play 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. They can spot actors and go, it's who's it from what's it. In a way, this early television is a lot like the pulp stories, in that these things are being churned out week after week, month after month. They are supposed to be transitory, ephemeral. These things are supposed to be designed to be here today, gone tomorrow. And here we are, 70, 80 years later, still talking about them. I'm sure for some of these writers and television programme producers and directors, that if they thought that they'd be under such scrutiny this many years later, would have taken an awful lot more time to get things just right, rather than think that will do for this week, and we wouldn't have had nearly the same amount of output or stream of inventiveness that we ended up enjoying. But when I first thought of Ed Earl Repp, I thought of his writing for the movies, which we'll get to later. But I don't think you'll find a better training for producing that or keeping up that tempo of productivity which writing for film and screen requires than writing for the pulps. And I think that this speed, this impetus, translates into what we see on the page and on the screen, which keeps everything zipping along, which keeps that narrative flowing, which keeps that heightened excitement that makes reading through these old pulp stories so much fun. But let's talk about the stories from issue 4, and you'll have to excuse me when I refer to my notes for some of this. Nelson S. Bond, The Ultimate Salient, is the lead story of this issue and has an intriguing framing device where we have a writer, Eben Clinton, who's a magazine writer, a pulp writer. The writer is visited by a university psychologist who has a manuscript with him, which is a transcript of a narrative that he has received from the future, and using the Pulp magazine, he wants to send a message back. This is all done in a contemporary setting, and then we lose that setting straight away, and the story goes into the future itself, where we follow the travails of a last group of fighters who are fighting against a totalitarian takeover of the globe. They are called the Toties, but it's pretty easy to see that, especially writing in 1940, just another word for the Axis powers, and I think they throw in the USSR, but basically warning that unless we're fighting them earlier, this is the situation we'll end up in. This is a really solid novel, or novelette, depending on your view, with a great framing idea followed by some proper adventure. It does descend a little bit into a madcap interplanetary race at some point, which is a bit of a swerve, but I think that the ultimate salient is a sign of the magazine finding its feet, finding its niche a little bit more, and certainly an uptick in quality from some of the stories from the previous episodes. And then that feeling is slightly tarnished by the second story, which is Quest on Io by Robert Moore Williams. This is just a Western or prospector story transplanted to outer space, in this case the moon of Io, where our hero Andy and his talking teddy bear are prospecting for radium. It's a mildly diverting story, and it's well paced, but it's slight. The third story is our Ed Earl Repp story, Buccaneer of the Star Seas. Thaddeus Carlyle is the focus of this story, and he is a man from the 14th century who has been given the secret of immortality by none less than Roger Bacon. As with many stories about immortality, it's as much of a curse as it is a gift. Before you can say Dominus Vobiscum, we're in the far-flung year of 1970, and Carlyle is the captain of a spaceship going round claiming salvage throughout the solar system. He's a successful captain because he takes risks, and he takes risks because he has a little bit of a death wish, because he knows what he must do in order to prolong his life is not a nice thing. Our hero, Larry Wolfe, finds out the secret that Carlyle A is immortal, and B what he has to do to maintain that immortality. He has to stop Carlyle and find a way to save his ship and crew from rival salvage ships. All in all, this is very inventive and enjoyable and well written, and more I read of him, I quite like Ed Earl Repp. Story number 4 is Domain of Zero by Thornton Ayre. This isn't as good a story. This follows Clark Mitchell and his wife, who are piloting a spaceship around the solar system, hampered by Clark's alcoholic father-in-law, who, when left in control of the ship, runs it straight into Ganymede, which is a verboten world in the solar system. It can't be escaped. The ship crashes, and they're left on a freezing, desolate landscape. They go exploring and find a creature or a consciousness called Zero, who basically is going to keep them forever, and the rest of the story is just their escape. This is a largely forgettable tale, but I think perhaps the only adventure pulp story I can think of where yodeling is part of their salvation. Story number 5, and here's a name that some people will recognise, Donald A. Wollheim. First time he's written for Planet Stories, and I think the only time he wrote for Planet Stories. I'll have to check that. Captain Wanderman leads his spaceship crew to the planet P, which is in our solar system, but beyond Pluto. But the story doesn't start with Captain Wonderman and his crew. It starts with a very different setting. Again, on Planet P, but of a completely different technological aspect. It's a very sword and sorcery type of setting, or sword and planet type of setting, where we are rooting for the Umith of Tomb as she fights the forces of Nimbor, but they are losing. Wonderman and his crew intervene, but I really can't even begin to say how they do without ruining the whole story for anyone who wants to read it, and it is one that I recommend. It's very inventive. Story number 6 is The Hermit of Saturn's Ring by Neil R. Jones, and this deals with a character called Jasper Jessen, who is the last surviving member of his crew when the ship is overtaken by an animated and belligerent cloud. The story is well written, just a little bit thin on plot. Story number 7, Venus Has Green Eyes by Carl Selwyn, shows us that even in the far-flung future, 1940s misogyny is alive and well. Flip Miller and Charlie Mead are fur trappers on Venus, so far so western, but they talk about a thief stroke pirate who, whilst being a strong female character, is slightly undermined by calling her Captain Vixen. If you're reading this story and you've got to this point and you think, well, this is all a little bit sexist, A, you'd be right, but B, I'd read it to the last line. And the last story here, number 8, is Revolt in the Ice Empire by our friend Ray Cummings. So forget 1970, we're even further into the future now, 1990. Our hero is John, and he joins Dr. Livingstone in a homemade spaceship in order to travel to the asteroid Zura, or the ice world of Zura, which is in our solar system, to follow up on the Doctor's supposition that there are vast quantities of a wonder drug, a drug of which there are only traces on the Earth itself. Now, if I was to say there had been a failed expedition to Zura some years before, I think you might know what would be coming next, and you'd be right. This is a world, this is a universe where space travel is not a regular occurrence. But this does have all the ingredients of a classic pulp tale. There is a native population, there is betrayal, revolt, and escape, and of course, there's a lovely lady for John to fall in love with. Ed Earl Repp was born in 1901 in Pittsburgh and died in 1979 in California. Until the stock market crash of 1929, he had made a comfortable living as an advertising and publicity executive, but the bottom fell out of that market, as it did with so many other things, and he turned his hand to writing. Again, we're talking about a writer that really churns out a lot in order to keep the bills paid. To take a quote from a little biographical feature that appears in this issue of Planet Stories, he says that when I started, I thought 1,000 words a day was a nice day's work, but now my regular schedule calls for 3,000 words daily. That's 1 million a year of nearly all types of pulp fiction, western, fantasy, adventure, love, published under various bylines. That's an impressive but not unique level of output for a writer. I don't think all writers kept that up. I think many writers got to something like that for a year or two, but I also think that the writers that we remember are the people from that pulp age who were able to churn this out year in, year out. As a lot of these stories are ephemeral, it's got to be a case of just chucking a lot of stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks. And you have to be adaptable, as Repp was, not just to be able to write science fiction, but be able to write adventure or western. We've seen this with some of the other authors that we've already covered here. But to take it back to the beginning of Repp's writing, he wrote The Radium Pool in 1929, the same year of the crash. So lost his job and got straight on with doing something else. The Radium Pool was subsequently produced as a novel alongside 2 other short stories under the name of The Radium Pool, and that came out in 1949. But here we're just talking about the novella. As an earlier work of his, I think you can see his influences on his sleeve quite clearly, and the influence here is Ayre's The Moon Pool, which is another story about a location which has, for want of a better word, a magical gate taking our heroes to another part of the solar system. It's an entertaining adventure story, and you don't have to take my word for that. Hugo Gernsback decided that it was, bought the story, and asked Repp to produce 24 stories a year for him for Wonder Stories and Ayre Wonder Stories. And with that, he has a new career as a writer, producing that 1 million words a year of pulp stories, but then branching out just 5 years later, writing for film. And this is really, really where Repp makes his name, or how he's remembered, and that is as a screenwriter for Western movies. From 1934 until 1952, he writes or helps write some 30 odd films, starring the likes of Tex Williams, Reb Russell, Gabby Hayes, Dick Foran, Charles Starrett. He also writes under pseudonyms, and in one film, West of Cheyenne, the Charles Starrett's character is called Brad Buckner, which is one of the pseudonyms that Ed Earl Repp uses. But whilst writing for the movies, he still keeps his hand in at writing for the magazines as well. And from 1939 to 1943, he writes a series of stories about a scientific detective called John Hale, Laboratory Sleuth, who I'm sure, if he'd have been writing these some 30 years later, would have become, a Quincy show, or one of these endless forensic detective shows that I've never watched. But Repp kept mostly to short stories and scripts. He did share a novel with L. Ron Hubbard. Thankfully, that's all he shared with L. Ron Hubbard. And if writing 30 westerns doesn't give you Western bona fides, saying nothing of all the Western pulp stories that he wrote, try this one on for size. Ed Earl Repp conducted the last interview with Wyatt Earp in 1929. The next issue of Planet Stories, Winter of 1940, includes some returning writers: Nelson S. Bond twice, Ray Cummings, Otto Binder, Ross Racklin, and John Russell Fearne, still writing as Thornton Ayre. But we do have the first story from Lee Brackett, and if you're going to talk about screenwriters, Lee Brackett's got to be one of the biggest names, or one of the names that's wrote the biggest movies, with both The Big Sleep and Empire Strikes Back under her belt. That having been said, I think my next pulp video might not be science fiction. In honour of the Spring Into Adventure reading event taking place in April and May, I might take a quick look at an adventure pulp just for a little variety. But I'll be back with Planet Stories before long. Until then,